Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rob Bailis, the Artistic and Executive Director of the Broad Stage. I'm sure we're all zooming in from many different locations, but we here at the Broad Stage are zooming in from Santa Monica, where we acknowledge the land we are on is Tongva land, and the traditional stewards of this land are Tongva, Chumash, and Kizh peoples. We honor their elders, those past, present, and those yet to come. It's a thrill to be here with you all today. That trailer you just saw introduces our new Reveal series. So you may have heard that the Broad Stage has commissioned 6 brand new works that will have their LA premiere or their world premiere on our very stage over the next 3 years. And each one of those commissioned works will get its own Reveal series. So today we are offering chapter 3 of the Reveal dedicated to the work of the team and their incredible piece, Reconstruction, Still Working But the Devil May Be Inside. So today, we're going to focus on the piece itself, on Reconstruction, and on how that piece may look when it appears on our stage, and to get a little bit more into the process of how it's being built and assembled as we speak. The previous 2 chapters are still streaming on our website, and I encourage you to go and visit them. The first of those chapters introduced a previous work by the team called Primer for a Failed Superpower. The second introduced really critical elements of the process for Reconstruction, and specifically how bringing an anti-racist practice into the rehearsal room really created foundation for both the method of the making of this work and practice in theater making in general. It was quite an astonishing episode, so I encourage you to check that out. And they both will feed into this conversation today. So I will now welcome 8 members of the team to join me as we start to talk about Reconstruction. As they're coming in, I will just say that Reconstruction in its essence is a piece about intimacy. It's about the possibility of intimacy, or lack thereof, between white identifying Americans, Black identifying Americans in an anti-Black United States. It's an ambitious project, a timely project, and in everything we've seen thus far, just an extraordinary undertaking. So we're honored to be a part and to offer all of our support to this work, and thrilled to be with you today. So we've got a bunch of you here and a lot to talk about. So I'm just going to dive right in and toss my first question to you, Rachel. And I think we'll essentially, please introduce yourselves when first you speak. I think if we go through all of that now, it's going to take more time than we have to cover. So please introduce yourself when first you speak. Rachel, I'd like to ask the first question to you, and then ask you to invite others also to chime in. You all had just come off of Primer for a Failed Superpower. You've made this ecstatic work about protest music and gone through this incredible process. How did Reconstruction sort of step into the afterglow of that moment and sort of find its way as your next project?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Rob, and hi, everyone. Rachel, I'll say she, her pronouns. I am the co-director of Reconstruction, is how I will introduce myself here. Say that I'm on Lenapehoking land colonially known as Brooklyn. And so, okay, so to this question, it was literally the opening night. I mean, there was an opening night and a closing night of Primer, just to be very clear. It was just 2 nights. And I think almost everyone who was present for this call was a part of that process as well. And that process, in short, featured this 32-person cover band singing these protest songs, and was really rooted in not just making a work about protest music or protest songs, but of the journey towards collective liberation. And that was the centerpiece of conversations that we had in the room, and how the fight for collective liberation is rooted in different generations and across the generations. And the distillation of that for us became this anthem adapted from Orion Johnstone, one of the leaders of that work, which was the idea that how we make is as important as what we make. Became the kind of rallying cry for that show. And in thinking about that, it honestly, like that night at the bar, it was just like we kept during primer, we kept having this conversation of like, what are we priming for? What are we getting our muscles ready for? And for that work, in some ways, we tried to answer that with this idea of like an organizing fair that actually followed the concert both nights, where we had these incredible organizers and activists talk about their work and give ways for people to get involved from the audience, whether financially or as volunteers. But it also felt like the team as an organization and as a collective had primed itself to make something. And it was like, we don't know what this conversation will be exactly, but we want to dive into thinking about race and in particular at that time, Gone with the Wind as a Confederate monument, because Gone with the Wind had been a novel and as well as a movie, but in particular a novel and story that we had looked at with a previous work many, many years ago in a inherently flawed way, because it was done with an all-white ensemble. And so thinking about, this was August 2017, so it was just as Charlottesville had happened. So Confederate monuments were on our mind, and it was like, let's fucking do this. Like, let's dive back into that, but with a very different version of the we who was doing that investigation. So that's where we began. And I'm gonna toss it to co-director Zhailon Levingston to add in more.
Yeah, unmuting. Hey, everybody. Good to see you. I'm Zhailon Levingston, he, him, his, and as Rachel said, co-director of Reconstruction. And by the time I was kind of looped into the idea of this, it was, based on this prompt of how do we approach this idea of Gone with the Wind as a Confederate monument, especially if we gather in a room that is much more representative of the world that we live in now, basically. And what I love about kind of the team's work and at least how this process started is it feels like Rachel kind of threw out this impossible question, this question that you can riff on forever and ever and ever and ever, as a way of really figuring out what the group really wants to say or really has to get out of themselves. And I think that is just such a distinctive way of starting a piece, in terms of setting the tone that, like, though there may be folks who are traditionally in positions of kind of shaping vision or shaping what we're here to do, from the very outset, it's going to be us as a room, as a group of people, as a community, who are working towards something that ultimately the work will emerge from. And it was this idea of like truly allowing the work to emerge, that we ended up getting and kind of landing around this idea of intimacy, which came up, I would say, about, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, about like maybe a year into the process. I know it was from Jillian proposing that we all watch a lecture by Hortense Spillers. Yes, thank you, Rachel. This was in 2019. And in this lecture, this idea, this question of could Black and white folk actually share intimacy with each other? And Jillian, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way in which Hortense was defining intimacy was kind of this equitable exchange of shared knowledge. And that kind of, I remember that kind of like stopping the room in its tracks for not a day and not a couple days, but a few days. So long that like we maybe all kind of secretly wondered, like, what is happening now? But I think just to say, connecting it to the very first day we all got into a room together, knowing that we were making a project that could eventually become anything that the group wanted to emerge from this question, it was one of the defining moments of what has now been this kind of couple years long exploration around this topic, wherein many other topics have sprung from in interesting and fascinating ways. And so we've been working on it now for about 3 years, and it is many things, not just the prompt or question of Gone with the Wind as a Confederate monument, but really it's almost unspeakable to try to put it into a kind of experience or kind of play. It is an event that will happen, and that is, I think, what we all know to be true. Yeah, I think I'll stop there at the idea of it as an event that will happen.
I want to pick up right from that spot. Thank you for leaving it there. Which is to say that much of your work, clearly it's not as if you're coming into the room to necessarily write a script. You're not necessarily all sitting together in the way that you create, going from the page to the stage in a sort of linear fashion. It's an incredibly collective manner of making. So I wonder, all of you are wearing different hats. All of you are, simultaneously writing, stitching together, designing, influencing every element of the making. I wonder if we could talk a little bit just about some of those pieces that you think are going to actually land in this event that will happen, and how they came to be in the rehearsal room. And I'm going to ask Zhailon if you would step in.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Hi. Hello, I'm Zhailon, one of the writers/performers of Reconstruction. Wow. So I get to say, since this is on the record, whatever I say, it's going to go in the show. We'll just say, no, just kidding. Just kidding. Well, it's interesting, Rob, that you ask about, what's sort of emerging as looking like it's going to be in this event, because we're just coming off of a week together last week, some of us in the Reconstruction crew, in a group that we call the Weaver Committee, that has been working together to basically go through the 546, is that right, Janae? 546 pages?
Of text that we called scenes, an additional probably 600 of conversation.
An additional 600?
Ish.
Yes. So many pages that Janae herself, as well as, I believe, Allie and some other folks maybe put together.
Mm-hmm. Yep, me, Allie, and Laura really took the reins on that one.
Yes. So in that, and Marika, Libby, Janae, feel free to, and Zhailon, you were there. Feel free to jump in and share more. But we've spent a lot of time really looking at how intimacy has expanded in the piece, to include intimacy with the self, and what does it mean for white folks to have intimacy with themselves and with each other. And I think the other thing that definitely feels core and will be in this event, or part of this event, is the concept of polyrhythm, the concept of, someone help me explain polyrhythm, please. But basically, yeah, Marika, go ahead. Or Janae.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and I'll say this is something, it's at this point a paraphrase of a paraphrase. In 2019, collaborators James Monaco and Jerome Ellis brought in a demonstration on polyrhythm and polymeter. Polymeter is a kind of polyrhythm. Polyrhythm just means multiple tempos going at once, which covers everything from, I think he said, Ringo Starr style simple drumming. You know, we have a bass going with a snare, going with a tom, and they're all doing something different. But in polymeter, you know, not everything is starting or entering on the same downbeat. And things are going in different time signatures. And so as you listen to this music, you hear rhythms sort of, we've described it as sliding off and on one another. And this has brought in many useful metaphors, both like structurally, dramaturgically, spiritually, these ideas that because polymeter is structured this way, that there are many doors into the music because there is no one downbeat that you must enter on to join it. And so I think a question for me has been like, how do we make the happening, what did Zhailon said? The event that will happen feel like that, that there's maybe no one place to start or one place to finish. And then, you know, it brings into, you know, I think ideas of autonomy. James said something about part of the task of playing music in polymeter is that you must both listen really closely to yourself in order to sustain what you are doing and not sort of slip into someone else's rhythm, but you also have to listen to other rhythms at the same time, which sort of goes back to what Jillian was saying about intimacy and intimacy of the self and between different pairings of people. Did I do it?
Okay. It's a pretty good description of polyrhythm. That was great.
Janae, do you want to add to that as someone who heroically transcribed like 3 different versions of the lecture?
Sure. I don't, it's actually, having been the person to transcribe it, I'm like, how can I say this in my words and not just say what people said? But I think we kind of landed in this place of at one point someone brought in the phrase like the religion of this room, and it feels like polymeter is kind of the religion of the Reconstruction room. And that a lot of that in terms of intimacy came with this idea of what Jerome described as group solitude versus solitude, and the intimacy of like being alone with yourself and being alone with somebody else, and what that looks like, and kind of how we can create that in each other and for each other and for other people, which ties to like many other things that I think were kind of selected or pointed out as things that we loved. I'm thinking particularly of Jerome's sound baths as something that we all kind of really love, and we're like, some sort of version of a sound bath will probably exist in the event that will happen, because it's another kind of version of that intimacy.
I wanted to ask really the weavers present, and I believe that's Janae, Marika, Libby, and Jillian, I believe, sort of as a group. As you're stitching this together, you're going through a massive amount of material. You know, has there been a tendency or even a desire to hang on to something as tyrannically organizing as a narrative, or in any sort of story shape that you are willing to talk about in terms of characters and inhabitances that live in this world? You know, is there any of that has been either plaguing you or helping you to let this piece emerge? I hand it to the weavers.
Marika, talk about the circles.
I can talk about the circles. I mean, I will also say that I think narrative, not so much. I think if anything, there are characters that have emerged, or versions of characters or shades of characters that we're interested in keeping around because they contain interesting things and then do interesting things when they're put in relationship to other characters. But plot, not so much. And the circles that Janae is referencing is going back to polymeter. One thing that was said was that, if you were to sort of draw a version of sheet music for polymeter, instead of, a staff with lines that move linearly, it would be a bunch of circles of different sizes overlapping each other. So I think if we sort of came up with a bunch of different ideas about what that could mean. For instance, is the passage of time in this play, this happening, following these different circles, and each circle represents a ritual that, these characters must perform over and over. That is one of many different structures that has sort of been tossed around. And I think at this point, we're interested in not throwing anything away. I think it does, as we sort of repeat and study, there are sections and pieces of writing that emerge as, the most popular, the most vital. But I think at this point, nothing is off the table.
Awesome. Jake, I wanted to turn to you quickly and talk a little bit about the character that's developing for you and the role that's going on for you. And also, since we're going to be getting a little bit, in just a little bit, into a glimpse of the house, sort of a sense of your connection to the house itself.
Sure. I am Jake Margolin. I'm one of the writers and performers in this piece. And I am coming to you from what's now called Houston, which was Akokisa land, or Akokisa swamp for a long time. And one character that I'm working on that is, I think, continuing in this piece, is a character who's mucking out a house after a hurricane. And I was thinking, as you guys are talking about how this whole project emerged, that something in a previous work that we did called Architecting was that piece also focused on a hurricane. And it's a hurricane that I knew through television. I knew through news reports. And I knew as a metaphor was Katrina. And then this project came not long after I got to know Hurricane Harvey in person. And one of the things that made me want to bring this into the room, and I actually think it was my husband, Nick, who's the set designer for the team, as well as one of the writers for this piece, who brought Hurricane Harvey into the room, is that hurricanes, like most catastrophes, tend to amplify all of the social inequities and ills that we experience. And so we got to see in Houston things that maybe we would all like to pretend are in the past in the United States come right back to the fore in terms of where things got repaired, in terms of how people were impacted. And so it felt like this hurricane had a lot to speak to in anything that was talking about the Reconstruction era, that was talking about the legacy of Gone with the Wind. And so this character is mucking out a house that at this point I think is probably a family house, and is probably in the same neighborhood as another character. As Mariko was saying, these characters are exciting because when they get into relation, I mean, this is character, but when they get into relation with one another, sparks go. And it seems like his house is probably in the neighborhood of a Professor Lowe, who Jillian Walker is playing. And it feels like where the great richness is in this storyline is that the two of them get to unpack what their experiences of the land and the place that they were on, because the thing that happens with a hurricane is that if it gets into your house, you then got to go through everything that's in the house. And you literally got to go through all the papers, you got to go through all the furniture, you got to decide what you're keeping and what you're throwing out. And so it just works as a perfect metaphor for what we're doing as a country, as we're actually going through and rifling through all of these things.
Great. Because I think it'll be germane to some next questions and steps we want to take, I'm going to turn to our technician and John and ask him if he can play just the first minute of a clip here This is just the very beginning of Ratchet Fashion Show that we're going to look at. And we'll get a sense of what the set looks like, what the house looks like, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how that plays. So I'll hand over to you,
Stability. Welcome to the Ratchet Fashion Show. We are free Negroes not bound by the felt of your respectability. We are all up in your mama's finest linens. Drapetomaniacs, make some noise! I said if you're feeling crazy enough to run off of this motherfucking plantation, make some noise! I think I saw Frederick Douglass in the house. That's one uppity Negro. Is that Ida B. Wells? Looking Ida B. Wells. Now, boys and girls, sit back, relax, and get into these ratchet fashions. Ratchet fashions, ratchet fashions.
Awesome. I love it. I just love it. There's so much to unpack there. I just want to get started with, the basics of what you've shared with us, which are that, we're going to be immersed in this world, which is taking on incredibly complicated topics in a polyrhythmic, polymetered fashion. And I think that what I love is that what's emerging is that you're building the story out of ritual, you're building the story out of relationship, and the story is or isn't narrative, which I think is all the more freeing, and particularly as you're trying to get at these particular issues. So what's getting offered here is just incredibly rich, and I think just simultaneously, it has all the tools present for anybody viewing it to figure out how to find their way inside. Just seeing that little clip, I think, shows so much. The thing that I find so amazing is that you've made this incredibly concrete decision about this huge set. And it's this physical thing that's going to manifest. It's happening. It's there. And the actual things around it, or that it's contained, or that it's relating to, or that are underneath it, inside it, around it, coming into it, are complete, are not. They're not concrete at all in the same sense. So I kind of wonder, from the design side of this, for those of you, and I think here today, it really, Brenda and I think Marika can speak to, a little bit just how the design elements are emerging from this incredibly unique landscape of material. So Brenda, I'm going to toss to you first.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Brenda, she, her, and I'm actually coming from the Catawba land, which is colonially known as Wilmington, North Carolina. So I'm glad to be here. That's an interesting point that you make, that the set is actually kind of thought out and well and up, and yet I can't fully say that is true about the costumes, which is I feel like to say I'm the costume designer is not quite right. I'm also a creator writer, and I think that the design is clearly just as collaborative as the rest of the piece. I feel like I'm allowing it to emerge as with as much mystery and question as everything else exists in this piece. I think that we did initially latch on, at least I did, to some ideas. We watched Gone with the Wind as a group a few years ago, and in that very famous scene where Scarlett makes a new clothing out of the curtains because her wardrobe was destroyed. I think that inspired a lot of that, perhaps the Ratchet Fashion Show, and I think we brought that into the room when we were working, and we brought in some some corsets, some Reconstruction era pieces that helped us build, like literally build the framework for an idea of what type of silhouette or what type of garments might appear in the show. Although, while I think that is something I'm still attached to, who's to say, right? There's like, I'm even as this conversation is unfolding, I'm learning so much about this show. I'm not always at every, we're not always in the room at the same time. So I'm like, oh, I latch on to just images of like, or textures or words that inform so much about what potentially could go into the show. So it's ever evolving.
Marika, anything to add?
I mean, yes to all of that. And I also realized I didn't ever say hi. I'm Marika Kent. I'm a lighting designer. And yes, I'm also calling in from Lenape-Hoking. And that it's interesting because for, last week when we were doing weaver work, I wasn't really deciding or thinking about what that may or may not mean for design and design process. And, I find in design work, you can just sort of trust yourself, like the visual impulses will come. And I think too, it's hard to, imagine lighting specifically at this point. There's still a lot to learn about the environment, physically, spiritually, all of these things. And so I feel like the work I'm doing now as a designer is just to like deeply understand, what's at the beating heart of the moments that are happening and the work that's happening. And the rest will come later. I mean, I do think in the back of my head, I've been compiling a little, like there were so many times last week when I was thinking about like Carrie Mae Weems and like the Louisiana Project and, like certain things where I'm like building a little list of like, one day I'll make that little PowerPoint presentation but, to the group. But so far, I think, it's great to keep it fluid. Everything Brenda said about mystery, I think is absolutely true in this case.
I have something to add about the house, if I may. Yes, it is concrete in a sense, and it's fluid in that we are all writing this house into different, like we've talked about the house being a frat house and like the Gone with the Wind house, maybe, if that's still something we're interested in, and a house in the South and a house in the North all at the same time. So it is like it's a concrete thing, and it's also a representation of the way that Americans, or perhaps maybe all people, I'm not sure, like create the house as a denial of nature, which is something that Issa Davis, one of the writers, has been beautifully writing toward in the piece, and something that really we spent a lot of time talking about last week during Weaver Week, of like the house being something that changes as much as everything else and slips in and out of time. And as you saw as well, it comes apart. So we've even talked about having the audience possibly participate in the process of like moving the house around, so it's still all very much in conversation, I think, as much as anything else in this process.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak for Nick, but I think a part of Nick Bond, who did the set design, I think a part of what's brilliant, and actually it's hitting me right now really vulnerable about what he did, was that he like made a thing for us all to play in and then get to make decisions about whether or not it stays or goes, or, it's like there's something actually really beautiful about that set and the set of a house as an offering that then, as we continue to play, it changes, which is, why it's on wheels and why it is white and why it can do all of the things that it can do.
It's interesting. There's, a lot of discussion amongst all of you about the sort of the thread or influence of the concept of time. and what exists in time, out of time, you know, and particularly this is one of the ironies of that choice, I think, to lean into the notion of polyrhythm, right? Which is that it exists explicitly because there's an acknowledgement of time. You can't have polyrhythm without time. It's what defines it, makes it visible, and yet it refutes that time has any actual location. So there's something really profound about that, and I think that you're digging into that really beautifully as a cultural construct in a really, I think, substantial fashion. I want to take the word Reconstruction for a minute and put it through that time loop and talk about that for a second, because it's an incredibly charged and important word. It's you know, a word that carries with it all kinds of historical denials, all kinds of cruelty, all kinds of lies, and you know, and also in its own way, kind of like, in a sense, kind of like the house, you know, reconstructing, deconstructing, being built, being torn apart. There's a layer of metaphor there too. I'd like to sort of, for a second, ask you each just about the word, and how did the word come to the front of the piece for you, and where are you in relationship to that? And I'm going to actually toss to Libby here, so we can hear from you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Libby King, she, her. Thanks for having me, and it's really nice to see everybody. I am in Seattle, Washington, on the Duwamish land. And that is Rob, that's big question. I was one of our writers and performers in the show, and I were having a conversation about this recently, Amber Gray, about whether or not that title still was where we are right now in terms of starting this in 2018. And so I wonder about that. But it certainly feels like what we have as a room and a group really gone through in so many ways, and still are in the process of. And something that I think very excitedly, that maybe I'll throw it to Jillian or Zhailon, that came up last week during the Weaver work, was that we kind of found a moment that we think in the show, post Ratchet Fashion Show, where we might really dig into just the like history of Reconstruction and tell it in our way. And I don't know if either Julian or Zhailon want to talk about some of the conversation we had around that I got really excited by. And yeah, it's an emotional thing, and I think it kind of just it looms over our kind of our entire endeavor. And what are we reconstructing? Is Reconstruction possible? What was that Reconstruction? Why did it fail? So I'll pass it to Zhailon.
Would you jump in?
Well, just to say, to kind of, and I'm interested in what Jillian has to say, but maybe just to frame up a little bit. You know, I think Reconstruction gets talked about so often as a great failure in American history. And I think actually one of the biggest failures in Reconstruction is what happened after Reconstruction, and the complete and total wipeout of history of what happened during that time. You know, for the people who were actually living and thriving through Reconstruction, it was kind of this unbelievably triumphant period of possibility in American history that, you know, because of the time period that happens after Reconstruction, kind of like this great erasure that happens, we have completely lost. But what you have during the period of Reconstruction are, you know, towns that are completely run by Black people, where the dollar stays within the community. So wealth is actually being built. What you have is influx of Black representation in all levels of government, particularly the Congress and the Senate. which in some ways we have yet to even come close to reaching since then. You know, what you have is an ask that is not about assimilating, but actually having an equitable kind of redistribution of resources so that one can self-identify with themselves and to kind of have that same sense of belonging to a spot, to a place, to a piece of land. All of this happened in an incredibly intense and small period of time. And it's really unfortunate that we've lost so much of that history because, and why I think I actually quite still love the name Reconstruction is it points to how rigorous the imagination has to be on to be thinking about what happens after we deconstruct, right? And in so many ways, both in our piece, the content, is so much about what comes after this question of race. Or at least that seems to be a lot of what is firing people up right now. And that's why we talk about time so much, land so much, space so much, because what we're realizing is that after the kind of waste of time that talking about just racism is, there is this great opportunity to completely redefine, reconstruct, and reimagine every other element of what it means to do life together outside of the framework of white supremacy. And so just to say Reconstruction in the show as the time period, I think is very also married to pieces of the show that aren't attached to that time period, because so much of what we're trying to excavate, particularly for the Black company members, is a way of doing life together that is ratchet, which is to say, without the gaze of white people. You know, can I be in company with you without your gaze having to do with anything that I do? I'll pass it to you, Jillian, if you want to speak to that as well.
I mean, I ain't got much to add after that. I'll just say, yes, ratchetness and wildness also, which is a term, Zhailon, that you have evoked in the room several times. And also I would say, just to go further with what you're saying, that we're really looking at, and I'm really interested in personally, looking at the reconstruction of the imagination, like the ability to imagine, as Zhailon's saying, outside of the constructs of white supremacy and supremacy culture as a whole, because we've also been talking a lot recently in the Weaver Committee about Indigenous honoring and what that means. And so it's really about, in some ways, drawing from the period of Reconstruction, which was a really radical moment that most of us don't have access to because of just the poor education that we're given about that time period, and really about anything related to race, really. So I lost my train of thought with my education rant, but essentially it's also about reconstructing and inviting the audience to reconstruct their imaginations. Hopefully, you know, I that's an aim that I'm really interested in us continuing to try to explore as a company, which also means that we as individuals and as a group have to continually be looking at our own stuff around this. Oh my gosh, my alarm is going off.
You're on fire, Jillian.
On fire.
That was definitely your home a hard ashe. I think the only thing I would add is that when you first asked the question, I'm a real language nerd, and there is this whole lowercase r reconstruction concept, which in a lot of ways is like what we've been doing in making the piece, is like just like carefully looking at the time period, and also intimacy and time, like really reconstructing these smaller ideas in our minds. And so I think also a part of the reason that Reconstruction feels so right is like outside of like our relationship and the piece's relationship to like capital R Reconstruction, the time period, like we are constantly lowercase r working on reconstructing different things for ourselves and the collective and the work, I think.
Wonderful. Before we move on from Reconstruction, the word, the concept, the title, anything else from Marika or Jake or Rachel on that? Okay.
I'm just thinking about oh, Marika, you want to go? Just an artist who I've gotten to spend a bit of time with now, an incredible artist, Indigenous practitioner, director, maker named Tara Moses. And Tara has talked a lot in this group, as well as I've heard her speak publicly about reconciliation, conversations about reconciliation. And Tara is like, hold on, for there to be a reconciliation, there must have been a conciliation. And I think very much from her perspective there, that has never existed. And so it feels like it rings very strongly against, and this obviously, Milta was a huge part of episode 2, but the place that Milta Vega-Cardona started much of this work with us is this module that the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond uses, which is undoing, is all about undoing. And this question of like, both brushing away to like get back to some sense of foundation or soil that is genuine or authentic, and maybe very simple, and maybe a place of of just like literally like starting from base. And so it's this, I'm just thinking about the simultaneous holding of like construction and reconstruction little r, and then reconstruction with a capital R. And so hopefully, yeah, all of that is alive in some way.
I'm going to dive into the construction part for our last bit of time together. So, as you've shared with us, there's been the creation of this set of the house. There's been a lot of interaction with how that element might elicit or help evolve the way in which you're tackling this particular set of material, how it might contain it or help reflect upon it. There have been a whole series of rituals that you've made in rehearsal, which have, resulted in the generation of some characters who we're going to get to know, and some journeys we're going to be on, and also places where intersecting elements of expression are going to be in their, literally to their own tune and in their own way, giving us, that event sensibility inside of the show itself. So there's all these elements of construction. I want to talk about the task ahead. You've got 600 pages of material. You've got this amazing physical being of a set, all these things that are at play now. And over the next year, this is all going to funnel down to that event that's going to happen on stage in some way, shape, or form, which I'm personally totally thrilled about. I think it's going to be amazing. And it's just a privilege to be with all of you to, on that ride. So I'd love for you to speak, and first maybe just from the weavers, and maybe from the directors, and maybe from designers. What is your task ahead? How do you feel about getting from this incredible body of work you've generated to the thing that you're going to, and again, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. You're not all the way through this process yet, but what's your task ahead, and how do you see yourself architecting this thing that's going to land in a year or two? So I'm going to start with the weavers.
Well, I can say where we ended last week quickly, which is that we ended in a place of really taking some time the next few months to have a period of integration with the 600 pages of material, as you said, and really allow all that we discussed, all of the questions that came up, all of the concentric circles that we drew, to land in our bodies. And then we'll come back together and really lay out some, what did we end up calling? Not document. It's not a document. It's a living, breathing, textured Bible that we're going to put together before we all hopefully meet up together in Alabama. Yeah? Anybody else want to add anything?
I can pick up on the Alabama front, and Weavers, like, please, yeah, feed in more if you want. But so we have this residency will be like the next major concrete time that the whole company, or the majority of the company, will be all together. And that is, that was supposed to have happened in June 2020. And obviously was altered by the pandemic, which, like I think so many projects, has afforded this time to actually reconceive. I mean, the Weaver Committee didn't exist until essentially a Zoom that happened in June 2020. So this whole process, in a way, was kind of birthed from this moment of pause and the creation of a whole lot of time. And so we're now, it looks like hopefully fall of this year, going to be all together in Montgomery, Alabama, in residence with Alabama Shakes. I think we're still figuring out if our set will be there or not, or if our set will just live in our mind's eye. But where essentially whatever this living, breathing, textured, textile thing is, will get put on, worked into, shared with, and likely deconstructed and reconstructed further by the full company, because the Weaver Committee is sort of this small group within the larger group. And then from there, I think we'll figure out, and this is a big part of what Zhailon and I kind of try to do in concert with Allie and Laura on our producing team, is sort of intuit, propose, and then be also very flexible to what the room feels might be next steps for manifesting, and trying to do so very much with a spirit of abundance and patience and spaciousness, looking towards, I think, what we're discussing of like a fall 22, maybe, first performance somewhere.
And Zhailon, anything to add to that?
No, other than it will happen.
Zhailon, I was thinking of something you brought up to me recently about the imaginary crisis. And I don't know if I was like thinking about, why am I so calm? That there's so much we don't know that we're like talking about mystery, but we have so much that we do know. And like, as we talk about how we move at the speed of trust, like, I'm just like, there doesn't seem to be imaginary crisis. It's just, there is just like a lot. I can see all of you nodding, like, we got this. It's just, and everyone nods, is like, yes, a textile collage document. That is wild. But we are like, yes, that's what it will be.
And I think ultimately, to Jillian's last point, it's like if we can make the audience feel that sense of whatever that is, that feels like worth the time spending with us, which may be quite a lot of time that they may spend with us, because the show has no time limit currently. But yes, to everything Libby said.
Terrific. And any last words from our designers about stepping into this process as it evolves, and what the task ahead may be after Alabama Shakes?
I don't fully know what the full task ahead is, but I'm so excited for what's about to happen. I think I have vague ideas, but I'm also like surrendering to the idea that I have no idea what it's going to look like. And I think in my head, I feel like, oh, there should be, or maybe we could do some type of design residency or collective where we can throw out imagery, and I have faith that everything will emerge as it will.
Yeah. I mean, I think I find it helpful to think of it as like, atoms separating and recombining every time in every next step. And then like every time that happens, there's like a slightly different set of people and like different things. Like we may or may not have the set. We might be in this space or that space. I know when we were working last week, something that came up a lot just because we've been working on the page so much is like, oh, is this an opportunity to choreograph this or show this or make this visual instead of, a piece of writing? So I wonder if one of, maybe not the next step, but a next step in the near future is, bringing in more time dealing with movement. And then also to say, I mean, Rob, what you mentioned earlier about how we're thinking about time and how that informs our process. I think the reason I feel in line with that calm is because everyone seems to be on board with the idea that efficiency is like the antithesis to the embracing of that method. And I feel like if, even one or two people didn't feel that way, things would feel different. But I think, being able to look around the room and understand, no one is expecting me to like turn in this on this due date. And we can actually just think about what are we trying to make? So yeah, maybe not thinking more than 2 steps ahead at this point. We'll recombine. We'll share what the Weavers did. We'll be on our feet in the fall, and then from there, I think it will become clear what happens next.
I think that sounds spectacular, and we're just about at our last moment here. I just wanted to tell you all, it's such a beautiful act of trust and of faith to share where you're at this particular phase in the process. It's so remarkable for us to be able to have a sense of what you're going through and all that you're creating, and it's just going to give us all such an incredible way to receive this work when it's ready and when you're ready to offer it. So I thank you all for the time, and for all 3 of these chapters have been just remarkable. And I hope they capture for you as well something that you can reflect on when you're a year down the road from this. And you can think, wow, that's quite different, or that's exactly where we were headed. But regardless, we're headed there together. And I'm just really, really touched by your honesty and your bravery today. So on that note, Jake, Marika, Rachel, Janae, Zhailon, Libby, Brenda, and Jillian, thank you so much for being with us. The team, you're amazing and remarkable, and we're looking forward to seeing you in 2023, and if not sooner. So congratulations, and we'll talk soon. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.